Demetrius Big Meech and Terry Southwest T Flenory started out just like any other hustlers, selling bags of weed in joints in the mid-80s on the southwest side of Detroit, Michigan, products of poverty, facing foreclosure on their home for back taxes soon after their parents' divorce. The Flenory brothers come from a family of faith, parents attending church services multiple times per week. Their father was also a music lover and was involved in the recording of some gospel music back in the day. Charles Flenory and mother Lucille moved to Detroit in 1969 as Charles took a job at Fleetwood Cadillac. The Flenory brothers also have a younger sister, Nicole, who never got involved into the drug game. However, after 19 years of marriage and living in poverty on food stamps and having their lights and gas cut off on a regular basis, Charles and Lucille decided to divorce, which Meech said was the last straw. Meech and Terry began hustling bags of weed and joints to help out their mother with the bills. Within 6 months, all the bills were caught up, and the brothers, Terry specifically, had taken on full responsibility of the family bills. Around this time, Meech and Terry decided to level up in the game and started selling 50 bags of crack rock for a big-time cocaine dealer named E.D. Boyd. E.D. Boyd is the creator of the 50 Boys. E.D. is said to have been a millionaire with weight during the time the Flenory brothers were working for him. E.D., hailing from New York, was one of the major drug dealers in the Detroit area at the time. The 50 Boys would make $20K on a good night, like a Friday or a Saturday, and on a slow night would still clock in around $6K. However, all this money was going back to E.D. Boyd because it was all his weight. All he was paying the 50 Boys was $750 per week each. The 50 Boys had 3 members, Meech and Terry Flenory, and their childhood friend Derek Meech. On top of their plug, E.D. Boyd holding the brothers back, the 50 Boys, Meech in general, were making enemies in the streets. The 50 Boys was offering a good product, putting some competition out of business and moving in on the territory of others. This started a conflict with OG hustler by the name of Leighton Simon, aka The Beast. One night, as Meech was riding around with his childhood friend Roland West smoking a joint, Leighton Simon came roaring by and blasting shots into Meech's car. No one was hit this night, but it was a warning shot for a young drug dealer to stay in his place. However, Meech was too ambitious to let a few bullets scare him away from the game. Meech and Terry moved up in the game and started copying their own weight through a new connect, Lawrence Noel, who had a Colombian plug. This put the Flenory brothers over the top as they would become the kingpins over the Detroit drug game. But Leighton Simon was still a problem, and his hate for Meech grew seemingly by the day. And one day, at a club, it reached a boiling point. Leighton started a fight with Meech in a club one night, which ended in shooting, and Leighton's brother Elvis being killed, and Leighton being shot in the groin, and now has to walk around with a bag, which had to be humiliating for an OG drug dealer of Detroit to let some teenagers do you like that. This sparked a 2-year war between the two sides. Meanwhile, the Flenory brothers began making more money, going from 1 to 2 kilos all the way to 20 to 30 kilos, putting themselves at the top of the game in Detroit by wholesaling to all the other drug dealers in the area by offering a better quality and a lower price and cutting out any other competition. However, even back then, you could see the sibling rivalry beginning between the two brothers, as Meech was a party animal who would always go out and be in the spotlight and having a good time, while Terry was more business oriented, laid back, and low key, more of what you would expect from your typical drug dealer who would be trying to keep a low profile. However, the brothers always had each other's back and always split everything 50-50. Like their father, Charles, the brothers had a love for music and a love for hip-hop culture, and even back in the late 80s got their style from hip-hop culture, imitating the wardrobes and styles they saw rappers wearing on Yo MTV Raps. However, the end of the 80s had a bittersweet ending for the Flenory family. One night in 1989, Meech was smoking a joint in Coney Island parking lot with his childhood friend Roland West when Layton rolled up on the two and began aiming directly at Meech with no intention of missing this time. Meech was hit and rushed to the hospital with multiple gunshot wounds. But Meech never let this shooting even fazed him. It was reported that Meech was back in the streets just days later, running business like nothing ever happened. However, something did, and from this point on, the whole crew began staying strapped up 24/7. And as for Meech, he had aspirations to become the biggest drug dealer in America, not just a local legend of Detroit. And in the beginning of 1990, Meech left Detroit for good. Terry would remain in Detroit, overseeing the operations of the drug business, while Meech would look to grow the crew, which was now called BMF, the Black Mafia family. And another one of Meech's childhood friends, Troy Binford, told Meech about Atlanta, the nightlife, and more specifically, the brothers used Atlanta as a place they began to buy properties without being under the radar of law enforcement, as a way to launder some of all the money they were raking in at this point through the drug game. Meech moved methodically when entering Atlanta. He decided not to bring a bunch of guys from Detroit with him to take over someone else's territory. Meech wanted to move in as the plug for Atlanta. So Meech would show up at all the biggest clubs in Atlanta, throwing crazy amounts of money and drawing in the attention of the other ballers and hustlers in the area. This is when Meech would move in with the opportunity he could present them with to make more money teaming up with BMF. So Meech began setting up distros in the Atlanta area. Now the Flenory brothers had Detroit and Atlanta on lock, and it was time to expand even more to become the biggest drug dealers in the U.S. Meech also met his baby mama, Latoya Yutzi, after moving to Atlanta, so everything appeared to be going great. But in the drug game, there is always trouble on the horizon, and soon after setting up shop in Atlanta, there was a series of busts of the Colombian drug route coming in through the southeast coast, mainly the Miami area, and by the mid-90s, things had completely dried up. At this time, the cocaine began coming in through the Mexican cartels, bringing in shipments through Texas and California. So in 1996, Meech followed the drugs and moved to LA in hopes to find a new connect. While in LA, Meech linked up with fellow hustler Wayne Joyner, who was also out of the game at the time. The two connected, and by chance in 1997, while buying some weed to smoke, Wayne met someone who had ties to the Mexican drug cartel. John Paul Green Eyes Grammatico. Green Eyes people had more drugs than they knew what to do with, and Green Eyes brought in 1,500 kilos of cocaine in one day for Meech and Joyner. So, Business was back on. At this point, Terry was still overseeing the business in Detroit, and Meech ran the supply through his Atlanta distributors and took the show on the road, hitting the field to meet new connects in different cities throughout the US, using the same method he used in Atlanta. Show up at all the clubs, spend the money, draw as much attention as possible to draw the ballers and hustlers to him so he could bring them in and be their new plug. They started now moving weight into Memphis, Kansas City, Arkansas, Alabama, and St. Louis. Meech would look for someone who can move 1 to 2 kilos, take them under his wing, and teach them how to begin to move 20 to 30 kilos, taking up capos under him in each city. Meanwhile, as Meech lived as a party animal, always at the clubs having fun, Terry lived a completely different lifestyle. Terry loved fine dining and traveling, and he was always responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the entire organization. And by the year 2000, the operation grown to the point Terry now had to pick up and leave Detroit 10 years after older brother Meech. But Terry was not going to join older brother Meech in Atlanta. Terry headed to the West Coast and moved to establish a base out of San Fernando Valley to oversee the drugs that were coming in out of Mexico. It is reported that Terry was meticulous about how business was done. For example, the money had to be counted in a certain way. Press the money by hand. 5K stacks, 10 across and 10 down is 1 million. Being much bigger than his older brother in presence, Terry's presence was much more intimidating than Meech, also deeming him the muscle between the two brothers. Meech even admitted himself that at times he felt like he was the older brother and should be calling the shots, thus just adding to the sibling rivalry. But even to this point, everything was still good between the Flenory brothers. But Terry began to despise Meech about his public lifestyle, partying all the time and bringing too much attention to the family, not understanding that Meech was masterminding a way to do business in the Fed's face in an attempt to make the BMF name look legit. At this time in the early 2000s, it is reported that the BMF organization was moving over 2,500 kilos of cocaine a month throughout different cities throughout the United States. Meech became good friends with his capo out of St. Louis, Chad Brown, and made him junior boss of BMF, giving him the nickname J-Bo. At this time, Meech also became friends with J-Bo's house cleaner, Yolanda Yogi Jur, and made her his personal assistant. BMF became experts in hiding dope in cars and began using stretch limousines to move weight from state to state, with secret compartments hidden throughout the inside of stretch limousines that could only be opened when the car was on specific settings. So as Terry was handling the import and export out of California, Meech was again taking the show on the road, dropping off product and picking up the money. 2 weeks in one city, 2 weeks in the next. Meech would drop off the weight in a city, then hit the clubs for 2 weeks, then pick up the money and be on to the next location. BMF was not an organization that made it to the top through violence. Instead, they finessed their way to the top by establishing connections. BMF had over 400 members, and by this time had also moved distribution into Miami and Houston. It is reported that Meech was spending anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 a night in the clubs, and on April 22nd, 2000, Meech's son Demetrius Jr. was born. Meech was 31 years old. Meech also started funding different hip-hop executives and rappers' music's career in Atlanta at this time, including Jermaine Dupri, P. Diddy, Suge Knight, rappers Jeezy, Nelly, Gucci Mane, and many more. Meech would pay off DJs all throughout clubs across the US, specifically in Atlanta, to spin the music that he was funding. Meech also established BMF Entertainment and Juice Magazine as a way to appear legit to the feds that were watching him throw all this money in the clubs every day. Those cops were definitely jealous of Meech, considering he was spending their annual salary in one night at a club. One cop in particular was so jealous of Meech. His name was Jack Harvey. He craved attention and always wanted to go after someone with a name. And in the second half of 2003, after over 15 years in the drug business and being nearly untouchable by the cops, the dominoes began to start falling. Starting with Doc Marshall, who killed a man in self-defense at his home during an attempted home invasion. But when the cops arrived on the scene, they found over a kilo of cocaine in ledgers related to the Flenory brothers about a fraudulent car business named Exquisite Empire, a front for the Flenory brothers to buy expensive cars. The feds would use this information to press Doc Marshall from 2003 all the way to the end. As for Meech, he began posting BMF billboards throughout the Atlanta area saying, "The world is BMF's." This reportedly infuriated Terry on the West Coast because he did not want that kind of publicity coming back to their name, and he may have been right. From this point on, the feds began following Meech and his close associates everywhere they went, taking pictures at all of the clubs, and just 1 month later, things were going to get even worse for Meech. Meech's crew had been partying 21 days straight with no sleep, drinking, popping pills, smoking weed, and who knows what else, going from club to club. But on October 10th, 2003, it was all about to hit the fan for Big Meech. Meech invited a whole crew out to a party at Club Chaos in Atlanta, Georgia. And at Club Chaos was an associate of Meech by the name of Anthony Wolf Jones. Jones was Puff Daddy's former security guard during the time of the East Coast West Coast rap beef and when Diddy was dating J-Lo. Wolf is also responsible for murdering Suge Knight's friend and bodyguard Jake the Violator Robles and igniting the East Coast West Coast rap war. On that night of October 10, 2003, in Club Chaos, Wolf Jones saw his ex-girlfriend dancing in VIP where Meech was. Jones proceeded his way to the VIP section and mushed the girl in the face. Meech was having none of that and told Jones to go on, and he's not having that up in there. Jones told Meech to mind his own business, which led to a verbal altercation, then a physical altercation in the club, which led to Jones being kicked out. A short time later, Meech and his crew decided also to leave Club Chaos. However, Wolf Jones and a friend was waiting outside for Meech and began to open up fire, and a shootout was ignited, letting off over 60 rounds. Meech was shot in the ass, and Wolf Jones and his friend Lamont Gertie were both slain. Meech was later taken to the hospital for his gunshot wound and was there charged with a double homicide. But it was a weak case with no evidence. Meech was even tested for gunpowder residue on his hands, in which he had none. In fact, it was reported that someone literally jumped on Meech to cover him during this shootout, like Secret Service would do for the president. In the interview room, when questioned by the cops, Meech was extremely drunk, coming off 21 days of straight partying. In the interview room, Meech pissed in the corner and laid across the interview table to answer the questions of the cops. At court, Meech was given a $50,000 bond and released to house arrest, which isn't normal for a double murder case, but because the prosecution's case was so weak, this is why this was granted. At this point, Meech and Terry's relationship began to reach a boiling point. Terry was sick of Meech and told everyone not to talk to Meech because he has on a different type of ankle monitor from anything he has ever seen. While on house arrest, J-Bo took over running Meech's part of the operation, but Terry started cutting Meech's product, taking 4 ounces out of each kilo. A kilo consists of almost 36 ounces, so we see Terry was repressing over 10% of Meech's dope and adding additional kilos for himself. Meech and Terry's relationship was reaching the point of no return, so Meech sent J-Bo to meet up with Green Eyes himself, essentially cutting out the middleman, Terry, who was cutting 10% of the work. But it was at Terry's 34th birthday party where Meech's crew showed up wearing free Big Meech t-shirts, and they also streamed Meech in through monitor to share words that evening. Whatever Meech said enraged Terry, and guns were drawn on both sides, and this officially ended Meech and Terry's business partnership for good. Terry rebranded his crew to the 263, which is BMF spelled on a foam pad, in which he was the sole boss. A few months later, in May of 2004, Meech beat his double murder case and was finally set free. So Meech charters an entire flight to go party in Mexico to celebrate. Hundreds were included on this trip, including celebrities like Little John, Megan Good, Da Brat, Kid Cudi, and more. The next month in June, Meech had a blowout birthday party celebration titled Meech, King of the Jungle, where he had tigers, lions, elephants walking down the streets of Atlanta, Georgia. Another shot fired in the Sibling rivalry, an obvious message to Big T now that Meech was the sole king of the BMF empire. Everything seemed to be all good, but much trouble was again brewing on the horizon. In the summer of 2004, a BMF associate by the name of Ulysses Hackett, aka Hack, was arrested in part of a drug raid and began cooperating with cops. September 2004, Hack and his girlfriend, Misty Carter, were found murdered, execution style. This sent the BMF task force into a frenzy, and they desperately wanted to start making arrests at this point. The next weak link the feds exposed was 2 high-ranking BMF associates, Jeffrey Lear and Amari O-Dog McCree, who were running a side hustle Big Meech did not know about. Lear was pulled over with 10 kilos but let go. The drugs car were seized, but Lear was let go. This caused confusion throughout all of BMF and caused the feds' wiretap to get hot as they tried to settle things out. Yogi, who Meech oftentimes used to send out orders, was caught on tape by the feds telling O-Dog and Lear that Meech says that they're messing up. This gave the feds the proof they needed that Meech was the boss and the shot caller. feds then scooped up O-Dog and Lear, who began to start snitching. And they said they get their drugs from Big Meech. This was enough for the cops to set up a series of raids in November of 2004, 2 days prior to Thanksgiving. However, Meech had a Fed in pocket who showed up at Meech's front door in a wife beater and boxers to prove he didn't have on a wire. And he told Meech that the feds have 1,200 hours of Terry's phone conversation, but absolutely nothing on Meech. He told Meech to leave immediately and go to Miami. Meech paid the man $10,000 cash at the time for this information. So Meech and Yogi hit the road, leaving behind cars, furniture, wardrobes, jewelry, and more. But they had no time to pack. While on the road, Meech received a phone call from J-Bo that the raids were going down. But by January 2005, Meech was back to living life as normal, but in Miami, Florida now. Still going out every night and partying like before. In Miami, Meech had a partnership with Club Crowbar, making Sundays BMF night at Crowbar. Later on that year, the feds started wrapping up the indictment on the Flenory brothers and BMF and wanted to get both brothers in custody before the indictment to prevent them from running and fleeing the country. Terry was arrested first in October of 2005 at a gambling party with over $6 million cash. Later on that month, Meech was arrested in Frisco, Texas on a possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. With both brothers in custody, the feds dropped the bombshell, a 42-person indictment, putting Demetrius and Terry Flenory at the very top of a CCE, continuing criminal enterprise, and facing a life sentence if convicted. However, there was little evidence on Meech, circumstantial evidence at best. Terry was caught on all the wiretaps giving orders. The only case the DA could bring against Meech was citing his lavish lifestyle. The two brothers handled how they did business completely different. Terry would always talk on the phones, giving orders and directions, and periodically switching up phones in case the feds had a wiretap. Meech, however, would never talk any business on the phone. Meech would not even talk business in his home or anywhere like that in case the feds had a bug there too. Meech was still using his partying as a way to run his organization. We all know from the start that Meech was using the clubs to meet ballers and hustlers in each city. But now that Meech was on top of the game, he was still using the clubs as a way to conduct business right in the feds' faces without them ever being able to know what he was doing. Meech would talk all his business in the clubs, giving orders and times and locations, whatever he needed to be spoken about, whispering into people's ears with loud music going on. Even if the person was wearing a wire, it would almost be impossible to make out what Meech was saying over the loud music and the general partying. Facing a life sentence, both brothers planned on fighting the case in trial. But the feds were not playing nice. Matter of fact, they started playing real dirty, arresting the Flenory brothers' father, Charles, on money laundering charges and making him part of the indictment for a home he allowed the boys to put in his name way back in the early 90s. The feds also indicted Meech's sister-in-law and nephew on similar charges. This was enough for Meech. He could not take seeing his family members possibly going to prison. And on November 9, 2007, the day the trial was supposed to begin, The brothers requested a face-to-face meeting, their first in over 2 years. In the meeting, you could hear the brothers screaming at each other all the way in the courtroom. Terry was going with God and wanted to take it to trial, but Meech refused to see his family convicted and go to prison, and convinced Terry to also take a plea to save their family. The brothers both took a plea and received a 30-year sentence for their reign as America's kingpins, ranging from 1990 to 2005. On May 5, 2020, Terry was released from prison early due to being at risk of COVID-19 health conditions. However, Meech was denied the same thing, and his exit date remains May 5th, 2029. Free Big Meech.